I've hinted at in a couple videos and a lot of live streams that the second most game that I play is Hearthstone. And today I want to sort of talk about some of the deck building differences between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Hearthstone. Just for a couple reasons. The first one is that maybe if you play one or the other, this video will convince you to play the other one. I think they're both really fun games, so whatever that means. But also, I think it's kind of interesting for Yu-Gi-Oh! Players to realize that a lot of the things in our game you might be taking for granted because not every single game has them. And there's some differences between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Hearthstone, but they're not completely different. I would say compared to like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is probably the furthest from any of them because it doesn't have a mana system or an energy system or a land system, but there definitely are some similarities, and I'll talk about those as well. So the first thing that I want to mention, and this is probably the biggest difference from anyone that's going from Yu-Gi-Oh! To Hearthstone or vice versa, in Yu-Gi-Oh! The stats of monsters really don't matter. Now that's a pretty big claim to make, and I'm not going to say that they never matter, but overall, you're never really playing a card because it has good stats. It absolutely helps if good cards have good stats. That makes them better. But there are plenty of good cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And plenty of great cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That don't have a lot of attack or defense points. Now, this is really different from Hearthstone because in Hearthstone, just changing one number on the stat lineup of a card can completely change how that card is played. I mentioned that in an earlier video where I said when the Hearthstone creators try to errata cards, they actually try to just focus on the stats rather than the effect. Or at least that's the first thing they try to focus on. Where in Yu-Gi-Oh! That wouldn't really work. Yes, it is cool when monsters have like 2,000 attack as opposed to 1,500 attack points, but overall, you're pretty much only looking at the effects of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. I don't think I've ever put down a deck simply because the cards did not have enough attack or defense. I think I'm only looking at the effects and the consistency and the tempo and all that sorts of stuff. And if you're playing Hearthstone and you're saying, well, okay, the effects on Hearthstone cards matter a lot too. While I agree with that to some extent, I look at cards like Kaliseth. Kaliseth is a really good card, and all it does is boost the stats of all the cards in your deck. Now, one of the reasons that card is so popular right now is because that 1/1 increase of all your cards actually matters a ton. In Yu-Gi-Oh! That's simply not the case. Whether or not that's because you don't have to sort of wait every turn to be able to activate certain cards, like with Hearthstone because of the mana requirement, that might contribute to it, but overall Yu-Gi-Oh! Has just sort of gotten past the point of where stats matter. Certainly stats can affect the outcome of the game when you get into certain formats where one monster has 1,900 attack points, one monster has 1,800 attack points, so in that matchup it definitely is helpful to have the monster with more attack, but overall no one's really dropping decks just because the deck doesn't have a high enough attack stat. Also, I would say that the life point total matters a lot more in Hearthstone than it does in Yu-Gi-Oh! And while I do think that in Hearthstone, it still doesn't matter a ton in terms of, like, if you look at the Warlock class, their hero power is paying 2 life to draw a card. It still matters a lot more only because in Hearthstone, you can always attack directly, where in Yu-Gi-Oh! Every monster basically has taunt, which means that you can't attack your opponent directly until you take care of all their monsters. But because that doesn't happen in Hearthstone, and because unless your opponent has a taunt monster in play, you can just hit them in the face, I would say that the life point total of Hearthstone matters a lot more because you can go from 15 health to 0 health in an instant, depending on how big your defensive lineup is. Now, Hearthstone does have the summoning sickness to where monsters have to sleep for one turn before they can attack unless they have charge, and that definitely contributes to the game being a little slower and not just automatically summon minions, attack face, win the game. But definitely it is a lot easier to attack directly in Hearthstone because you don't have to clear your opponent's entire board. And actually, if you did have to do that, the game would be very different. I remember that there was a Tavern Brawl, which is sort of like a weekly rule change on Hearthstone just for fun. And it was sort of like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Version of Hearthstone where every monster had taunt and charge. And the game was played very differently. That's really not how it's designed to be played, but it is kind of interesting to think about. Also, I think that I know that in Hearthstone, a lot of the times you see the vast majority of your deck. Now in Yu-Gi-Oh, we always talk about Pot of Desires, or I always talk about Pot of Desires, and Pot of Desires is really good because you don't actually end up seeing the majority of your deck in Yu-Gi-Oh. You probably see 10 to 15 cards, not counting your opening 5. And that means that you're having 20 cards in your deck that you're just never seeing, ever. A lot of them, even over the course of the match, you might not see all the cards in your deck. But in a Hearthstone deck, partly because the game is slower, partly because there's only 30 cards in the deck, partly because a lot of decks regain health, you'll see the vast majority of the cards in your deck, and oftentimes you are going into a game, even on turn 2 or turn 3, realizing that you're going to draw every single card in your deck if it's a control versus control matchup, which is really interesting. That sort of dynamic just is not apparent in Yu-Gi-Oh! And this also is different because in Hearthstone, you don't instantly lose the game if you run out of cards in your deck. You just take 1 damage on the first turn that you need to draw, 2 damage the next time you need to draw, 3 damage the next time you need to draw. So there'll actually be entire matchups decided by both players not having any cards in their deck and then just making use of the cards on their field and in their hand. So that's sort of a unique aspect that Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have, because in Yu-Gi-Oh! When you have no cards left in your deck, you instantly lose the game if you try to draw a card, which is very different from Hearthstone. But in Hearthstone, people will build entire decks around 1 or 2 one-ofs, and they expect to see those one-ofs. There are plenty of cards in Hearthstone that are very powerful, and the requirement for you to activate their effect is to have only singleton copies of cards in your deck. And then those cards themselves are included into that because they're legendary cards. You can only play 1 of them. And that the whole goal is that you're redesigning 28 cards of your deck just for the 2 cards in your deck that require you to have singletons. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, you would likely not see that. Now, it's a little different in Yu-Gi-Oh because you can't actually have an effect like that, because it'd be too time consuming to look through the deck and count out to make sure you don't have any duplicates. But in Hearthstone, because it's a computer only game, you have the opportunity to actually set up those effects. But those are really interesting because in Yu-Gi-Oh, very rarely would you have, and especially in Hearthstone because the cards are basically unsearchable, in Yu-Gi-Oh, I can't imagine building a deck of 1-ofs just for 2 unsearchable 2-ofs. Even if those unsearchable 2-ofs were really, really good, you just wouldn't have enough time to see them. You don't see all your deck in every game of Yu-Gi-Oh. However, I will say that there is a lot more variance in Hearthstone games than Yu-Gi-Oh games. I've always mentioned this in videos that Yu-Gi-Oh is by far the most consistent card game. This is partly because of how many search effects that we have, but this is also because of the extra deck. In Spirals, you don't need 2 specific Spiral monsters to summon Spiral Double Helix. You just need any Spiral monsters, any 2 Spiral monsters. You don't need to draw Quick Fix and Super Agent, which means that because of the extra deck, you will almost always see the extra deck cards every single game. If you think of like Paleozoics, you don't have to draw 1 Frog and 1 Paleozoic or 2 Paleozoics. You can just always get to Totally Awesome no matter what combination of cards you have, which is very different from card games like Hearthstone that do not have any sort of extra deck. So Yu-Gi-Oh, every single game, I mean, the idea is that you're making your deck as consistent as possible in terms of you want every single game to be able to do the same amount of plays. And the decks that are successful, if we look at like Pendulum Magicians or Spirals or Zodiacs, those types of decks are successful because they're always making the same plays. Now, that's not saying that they're autopilot decks. It's just every single match, you don't want to, some matches be like, okay, how do I play this when I draw, or when I have access to Zodiac Rapier, and how do I play this when I don't have access to it? The idea is that with any given hand, you have access to that card, so then you can play every single game relatively the same. How do you manage your resources around Rapier, not so much what happens if I don't draw this card or don't have access to it. Where in Hearthstone, I mean, you can, depending on how the early turns of the game goes, and even with the mulligan implemented into the game, there's the chance of you not seeing any of your turn 1 and turn 2 cards until like turn 8. Just because of how the deck is shuffled, and because the game just in general doesn't really have a search mechanic. I mean, there are search mechanics and they just implemented the recruit mechanic, but overall you don't have nearly as much searching power as Yu-Gi-Oh! So the amount of variance that you'll see over the course of any given set of games is quite wide, Even if you'll see your entire deck, the order that you see things can be very, very different, which I find pretty interesting. Lastly, I want to say that board wipes are a lot harder to come by in Hearthstone than they are in Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! We have a ton of board wipe cards that have basically no drawback, and then we also have a ton of board wipe cards that have a little bit of a drawback, but in Hearthstone, pretty much every board wipe card is balanced by either having a high cost or by being able to only be played on certain circumstances. They like require you to have a certain card in hand, or require a specific field setup, or only do so much damage. Where in Yu-Gi-Oh! We just have like Dark Hole and Regeki and Evenly Matched, and even like a card like Lightning Vortex doesn't seem very good in Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually would be very, very good in Hearthstone, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so board wipes are pretty tough to come by in Hearthstone, and that might sound crazy if you only play Hearthstone and don't play Yu-Gi-Oh!, but it is true. The board wipes in Hearthstone, something that I've noticed is that they all have a lot of different criteria that you need to meet, or they don't kill every single board. They're not always just killing everything. If you think of a card like Twisting Nether, an 8-drop that just kills everything, that's a pretty open-ended board wipe, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Is full of those types of cards, and those cards aren't even that popular. You don't always need to play those in your deck, where in Hearthstone you really want to have as many area of effects in your actual deck. But anyway, I think I've kind of rambled on enough just to talk about some of the differences between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Hearthstone, and also some of the similarities. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you play one of the games, feel free to try out the other one. Like I said, I play both of them quite a bit, and I think they're both a lot of fun, even if they are different. I do like Hearthstone because it's on my phone, but obviously I love Yu-Gi-Oh! Because that's what my entire channel is about, so I play that one quite often as well. But I will see you guys later. Bye.